zone, flow states, we call it has many names. There's many names for it, but I think most of us kind of understand what it is. But something I'm going to be doing here in the following slides, and I was going to say, if I had more in the audience, I'd ask this question. But as I do have at least 2 people in the audience right now, I would ask you guys, what do you think is the flow state? What is the zone? What is it definitionally? How would you describe it? I'd be curious to know what you guys think. I know you're both on your phones, actually, so it might be a little challenging, I don't know, to write a response. But I'm always curious what comes top of mind for people. And in any talk, I do like to try to get us all on the same page as well. So it's always really useful to hear where people are at. Being able to focus in a non-stimulated, easy kind of mode where time feels slow. Being able to act without thinking with energy less think. Yes, okay. I like how both of you said that, and the Flash especially. I really like that. We'll be talking about the energy component to this because it does. I think it's really important. So I'm going to give you guys a few bullet points here, and you can really define the zone in many different ways. And like with any phenomena of any kind, you can start with your observations as to what do you think you're seeing, what is there. And here there are some things that you guys already mentioned, such as the altered perception, that time dilation feeling, the act without thinking. So that you could say in other words, that could be automaticity or intuition. I'm not going to say automaticity because I can't say this word and I feel like a pleb when I try to pronounce it. And I don't know why I put it in the presentation. It's like I want myself to fail. But yeah, that's autonomous nature of your approach to everything. The mechanics of decision making, the game sense, the call outs, everything just it happens automatically. So that's definitely a quality that we see in game sense. And so, we're going to be trying to define some of these things because I think just as a general lesson, it's always good to try to define something because to have an objective, we need to start by being able to define the thing that we're talking about. And then once we can pin down that objective because we have the definitions in order, we can then create the strategy that gets us to the objective. And so that's one of the reasons why I like to try to start most of the time with a definition, because the goal of this talk is to help us to not just understand what the zone is, but also practically, actionably, throughout our training and the processes that we employ as players, how do we get there more of the time? Because we all would love to spend all of our time there if it were possible to do so. And similarly, we also would want to know, you can almost work it out in some respects with the kind of inverse logic in a way, where if, let's say, it is, as you say, an energy state that is super efficient, well, we can then start thinking about, well, what are the things that, drain our energy? What are the things that are disruptive to that focus? And so then through doing that, we can start to answer the question as to how do we avoid dropping out of the zone? And so what are some of the tools that we can employ there? So this is one of the reasons why I think it's helpful to go down this list a little bit. And so let's talk about the second one, the heightened awareness. This is one of the ones that I think is particularly fun because you can, of course, hit the zone when you're in practice. But the real juice that you can get to really launch you into the just absolute crazy levels of performance that you've never seen or really understood that were even possible for yourself is when you have pressure, and the pressure, comes on because of all of the stakes. And so we're talking about a match that means something to you. You've got skin in the game. It's you're playing an official match of some kind. You're playing in a LAN on stage. It matters. And usually, this is a perception thing. There's an internal sense of stakes, and there's an external sense of stakes. Internally, we will be looking at how we feel about our performance, the pressure we're putting on ourselves because we care a lot about what we're doing. What does it say about us if we fail in the pursuit of the thing that we've been trying to achieve for so long? This match is the moment to perform, and I put all this practice in, and I'm holding a belief that I'm better than my opponents and that I'm going to be the best player and that I should be winning. And so you're kind of up against it then, because what if you lose? That's going to suck. It's going to go against the beliefs that you hold, which will create a dissonance that results in negative feelings. And so, there's an internal pressure, and there's the external realities, which is, the stakes of, I have people that are invested in me, my team, it could be your family or friends. And if they're not emotionally invested in you, might be financial investment, because it's a team that's paying you, your stock value as a player, your career, all these things are on the line. So all this is to say that the perception that we have here when we're in a match environment creates this level of mental pressure that triggers that physiological change. And so this is important because, we'll start to have adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, all these extra, chemicals going through our system that dials up our nervous system. And that's really cool. It's kind of a double-edged sword, but it's really cool if you are able to harness it, because then you have this extra juice that you can't get otherwise that dials up, magnifies, intensifies your focus, your ability to pick up all of the small details in the game, get a very big resolution, like a much bigger resolution on all this data and information. And so that's when you can get to like crazy good performances. But it can also go the other way too. If you have mental game leaks, all of that energy can kind of spill, into the wrong direction. And if it's kind of attaching itself to some of those negative self-beliefs or thought patterns that are going to potentially sink you. So we'll talk more about that too. But yeah, so I really like the heightened awareness piece, because that's something else that we can kind of see in the zone. So we talked about the intuition a bit. The altered perception is also another fun one, because yeah, it's kind of weird. It's like, the whole experience of playing the game is different because our nervous system's dialed up. We're getting a different experience than we would otherwise get. And then I think the last thing here that I've got is emotional stability. And of course, emotional stability is an interesting one because for everybody it's a little bit different, like what that emotion is. But generally, it's going to be the case that you're kind of stable in the emotion or the emotional complexion of high performance for you. And again, could be that you're energized and calm. That's my experience. Or it could be that for you actually have this sense of intensity as well as the high energy as well, which would be somebody else perhaps. So we need to discover what that is for us. I'm just going to look at the question first before I get into the next slide. Oh, what's up, Maddie? Is that the real Maddie OW? Okay. Do you think it's more difficult to get into flow state with a higher stress situation, or would it be a faster path to it? Seems like it can go both ways. Nice, Maddie. I have to say, a lot of the aim training community, when I would make those videos, would always say it's like the aim training podcast for them. So that's awesome. Okay. Do you think it's more difficult to get a flow state with a higher stress situation, or would it be a faster path to it? Yeah, so there is definitely different entry points to flow state, and I wouldn't say that the flow state's like an on-off button, that if you meet certain requirements, you kind of get there. I think it's an emergent property of multiple things kind of happening at the same time, not needing necessarily every component. And so there is to me as well, like a level of not mysticism, but just like it's somewhat enigmatic in that way, because it is an emergent property, and that's actually something we'll be discovering through this talk a little bit as well, which is what are the things that we can do that make it a higher likelihood that we receive this emergent outcome of flow state. So let's look at the Yerkes-Dodson curve. I don't think there's going to be probably a performance talk I'll ever do with that doesn't feature it in some capacity, because again, what is important to understand with performance in general is that there are realities here that exist in terms of like how much stimulation you need to actually perform. You can't go against the reality of your biology in that respect, and also that's where you are mentally as well as other in other capacities, like how well are you slept, are you in a place where you're able to summon the energy because there's enough challenge. If there's not enough challenge or mental stimulation present, you're also not going to be able to hit this optimal zone as well. And I think the reason why I like to always come back to this is because as people that are interested in performance, we want to live here. We want to live here in this range of optimal performance, the optimal arousal, to be able to perform at our best, to learn at our best. And so everything we do should really come back to this, in my opinion. because, if we are setting ourselves up for success, to perform or to learn, we need to know, well, what do I have to do to get here? And where do my bad habits exist? Your bad habits are going to exist on, either side of this range. If let's say we're looking at the right side, where we've got the high levels of arousal and stress, anxiety, we're thinking about all of the mental game leaks. We're thinking about the anger, the anxiety, even the greed. We're thinking about all of those problems that come from being in that state of mind. If we're thinking about the other side of things, where maybe we're not challenged enough, there's not enough challenge in our training, so we can't kind of mentally engage with it enough. By the way, that is interesting, because you can change the level of challenge, even if let's say the opponents that you're playing against don't feel very challenging. There's ways that you can challenge yourself there, right? If you're really smart, you can kind of come up with some other solutions there, maybe limiters in your training. And actually, this is something that we do with pro players as well. There's just as a little side tangent here. With pro players, sometimes what we do, because for them, obviously, they're playing at a level of very high and high quality and refined fundamentals. And so to help them to actually learn more, we create artificial challenges that challenge what is kind of what they might see as perfect fundamentals, where we'll say, okay, you have to win rounds, but you can never use these parts of the map, for example. Stuff like that, so that they then have to start actively problem solving and going through a more taxing scenario mentally, where they're trying to problem solve in a different way. And so we're artificially creating challenge there. And so this again goes back to the same idea. If you're not challenged enough, you need to try to figure out, how can I get there with the circumstances that you have. But it could be that you're just, you're overtired. If you've played too much, then you're going to be on the left side of this curve. You just don't have the requisite energy to get to the destination. If you think about it like a gas tank, if you don't have enough gas to get to where you need to get to, your car's gonna crap out halfway, and you're not gonna get there. No one would argue with that reality. But as players, we emotionally feel like we are entitled to perform how we want to perform sometimes. And so this is something that's very important to recognize, that is that if you value high quality reps, let's say, because you want to be a consistent player, you want to improve, and this, by the way, relates to the zone, and we're going to get into why that is in a moment too, then you need to be a player that's looking after this, that's respecting the realities of your own capabilities. And if you end up being in a spot where you're losing focus, then you might be encouraging bad habits now. So you're entering lower quality practice reps, which we don't want. So there's a lot I can say about the Yerkes-Dodson curve and how it's useful for us, but I'm going to move forwards lest we be stuck here for the rest of the night. Okay, so again, another thing I always like to remind people about, and I'm going to do this here. I'm going to go over this super fast because it relates to the next slide. But this is a very common learning model that we you often use in the performance space, that kind of just it just shows kind of the cycle of when we start out kind of looking to improve something, we don't know why we suck. And then we kind of figure out, I kind of figure out why I've sucked now. So we move up to the conscious incompetence. We've figured out consciously, it's like, I can see that I've identified a category of my gameplay that sucks. And so then now we're like, okay, well, why is that? So we have like this like wrong analysis here that led us to this, or we just were doing it for whatever reason. And then we figure out, okay, well, what is the correct analysis? So we go to the right analysis, and then we start to understand, okay, so now I know what I have to change to improve at this particular skill, to improve myself as a player. So now, as I understand what the correction is, I'm kind of forcing it. I'm reminding myself, I'm looking out for that scenario. I'm focused on making this change, and I'm going to habituate it as over time, getting reps until I've programmed it. And then suddenly it is now an unconscious inside of our unconscious competencies. So we don't have to apply any mental bandwidth to this anymore, because you guys will absolutely, I think, understand the difference. And I have a great analogy here for this, actually. For those of you that have ever played chess, if you've played chess and you're looking at the board and you're kind of, I'm not going to draw a whole chessboard right now, but for some reason I'm doing it, and you're going to make a move. When you're a beginner, you have to kind of check and just constantly look at all the lines of attack. Is my piece exposed if I make this move? However, when you become like a more seasoned player, you've played more, you've got more reps, you no longer have to even think about it. You know that the piece is safe. You know that it's not exposed in any way. You don't even have to think about it. that means it's entered your intuition. And that means that all the time that you previously were spending checking all of the angles of potential attack to see if you're safe or not, now you just know that. So you've got all this mental energy that is now no longer needed to be spent on that particular process. And so that's what this is all about, going up the pyramid here when you're learning skills. And so the reason I remind us of how this process works is because as we go into the next slide, the zone is kind of interesting because generally speaking, we mostly are working on our C game. You know, it's easy to work on our C game because we all are painfully aware of the ways that we suck. You know, generally, obviously, we're human beings, right? So we are more inclined to focus on the negative aspects of ourselves in every capacity. It's great. However, when we're in the zone, we are playing at our peak. You know, we are in a place where we're learning something about what we can do that maybe we didn't even think that we knew how to do. And so that's kind of the interesting dynamic that comes up with the zone specifically. And so this is something that's Jared Tendler talks about. And so I've kind of taken a lot of his theory from this as I learned it from him. But, we had the multiple levels previously about, how we learn, and we program something into an automatic process. And again, if we think back, remember how the zone is automatic, right? Everything that we're doing is automatic. That's not by accident. It's not a magical property of the zone. It's because you've created that. Now, sometimes, things kind of fit together in such a way in the game that you can kind of make some certain leaps and you're just correct. You make every right guess, even if it's not something that's programmed in. And that's kind of is some of the magic of the zone. But generally speaking, what we can do as we improve as players is we can learn where our competencies are, and we can just keep working on things until we get to such a high degree of fundamentals. We don't encounter many things that we don't know how to deal with. So here we are, in the zone. Level 1, intangible competency. So we know the right play. We can see that we can do it, but we don't know why it's the right play. Like our intuition was like, yo, do this thing, but we don't know why. And when we're in the zone, again, we talked about how you do have the dialed up awareness. So you're not, typically exposed perhaps to even the data that got us here. So then, if you do some analysis, if you have the awareness to look at this moment, you do the analysis, you can then eventually get to, level 2. So we understand why, because we've done the analysis. Okay, now I've learned why this was actually the correct thing to do. It wasn't just this crazy thing I did and it just worked out and variance was on my side, but actually I understand why, and now I just need to figure out how do I integrate this into my normal game. So I'm not having to only be in my flow state before I can achieve this level of competency. So then we go into the same process as we talked about before. So now that we understand why, we can start practicing it actively. Now this can really be anything. It can really be, it can be mechanics. It can be, the decision making. It can be the game sense. It can be really any of these qualities that comprise you as a player. And then eventually, much like with the other model, you've done enough practice, you've eventually programmed it into your unconscious competency. And so what we're doing here is we're removing resistance from the game. Is one way to look at it. Because what the game is, in any game that exists on the entire planet, is a series of challenges. And every challenge is like a door that asks you certain questions of, are you competent enough to walk through this door? And so with flow state, what we're experiencing is we can just open any door we want. It's kind of what it feels like. Everything's going right. And so in our practice, as we improve as players, we never want to assume that we're ever going to be in flow state, right? We're never trying to create this state necessarily. We're just positioning ourselves into a place where our range as players is very tight because we've worked a lot on the C game. Our fundamentals have really tightened up. And we're putting ourselves in all of the right places so that we're allowing it to be the case that the zone can happen more easily and more often, is how I like to think about it. So what we're going to talk about here is the bloated brain. So there's another Jared Tendlerism where this is going to be the things that create problems for the zone, essentially. And we've already touched on some of these topics. So let's kind of go piece by piece here. So there is a consistent flow of information when in performance. And the zone is characterized by the effective processing of this. So we kind of talked about that, right? Where we understand that we need to not be in a place where the challenge is too much that we're having to consciously work out what do we even do. But instead, we're up against things that we've already programmed that don't really require much mental bandwidth for us to solve. And so this gives us the ability to have more capacity for processing, because the processing's not tied up in all of these other things because we've automated all of them. And so that's one of the reasons why we have this incredible capacity for game sense, because I think this is one of the most notable things that people experience when they're in the zone in esports, is you understand what's going to happen before it happens, all the timings, and it's almost unreal, your experience of it. Like, you almost can't believe it. You see things. In my experience, I've seen things before they happen, and then they play out, and I'm like, like, what's going on? So if there are too many points in a row that require conscious competency, we are less likely to reach the zone. So if there are too many points in a row that require conscious competence, we're less likely to reach the zone. So this is going to be because of what I just said. If there's too many things that require a big demand of energy to solve, then we don't have enough juice left that's available to be tapped into the game to allow the torrent of information to kind of flow in from the game, because we're having to spend so much cognitive bandwidth on these problems. So there's too much resistance in that respect. So if there's too many points that require competencies that are not yet developed, we will also not reach the zone. So if you're entering a scenario where you actually are not competent enough, there is some skill that is undertrained, is missing in some capacity, then you're also going to fail to reach the zone. And I have to say, because we have Matty here, this is something that in aim training has been pretty apparent to me. There are certain points of aim training that require a capacity or a skill that's multidisciplinary, and you might be really good at certain components of your mouse control, but you may be missing others. And in something that's multidisciplinary, in all of the different skills it requires, all intermingled and mixed together, you're going to be substantially weaker in certain spots, and that's going to prevent you from being able to hit that total flow. And so this is something that I think is interesting, because in aim training is an interesting environment because you don't have anything to focus on except just the aiming. But a lot of people struggle to maintain their focus throughout an entire minute of aiming. So it's kind of an interesting one. And I just wanted to mention that because Matty's here. If the brain has unconscious competency that is uninterrupted, the flow of information can be handled more effectively, and that increases the ceiling for performance. Because again, if we go back to the chess analogy, we are not bogged down. We got this extra time to think about all these other things. And this is why pro players have way better game sense than everybody else. This is why fundamentals need to be refined to a high level, because you need to make it so that your fundamentals are always just locked in no matter what, because then you never have to think about it. And you open up all this bandwidth to be able, it gives you time. It gives you more time than other people that are less quality in terms of their competency to think, to be able to extract the data from the game and make important intuitive leaps that you need to then be able to beat them. And so that's, I think, a pretty critical thing in this whole discussion. So we can now move to the things that drain energy, because if I go back to the Yerkes-Dodson curve, we need a certain degree of energy to be in this zone. And so if you've got stuff that's draining your energy, you're going to fall off this way. If you've got stuff that is leaking your energy, because sometimes you've got a lot of energy, but there are things that leak your energy. So what is that? It's anything that is not going into the game itself. So the thinking that you need for the game, the decision-making, the checklists, the communication to your teammates, actively trying to solve problems as they appear in the game. All this stuff is focus, and that's going into this optimal zone. But sometimes, if you start to get a little bit tilted, if you get frustrated, if you get hesitant, if you start to be like, oh my God, I'm just getting like the variance, like they got so lucky. Suddenly, what does that thought do for you? You're spending conscious time and energy, and also you're allowing a negative emotion start to come into play. And this is a form of energy leakage. And so that energy leakage is taking you away or making it less likely that you can stay in this optimal zone for performance. Now, it's obviously, not the case that you'll just completely lose that zone instantly, but it's a death by many cuts, I would say. And so there's lots of players that get a bit angry. They can kind of play with that anger, and they might be players that are generally better with more intensity. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Everyone's a little bit different, and they might be able to, with the frame of mind that they have, kind of turn that back into kind of like, into the right mindset again. But for some people, if they get angry, that's just going to send them spiraling off to this like huge energy leakage, and then it turns into a problem that spirals and grows, and so then you just you fall down this side of the Yerkes-Dodson curve, and so we don't want energy leakage, in either direction. So that's why I wanted to give you the visualization there. So stuff like tilt, as I just mentioned, frustrations and complaining all require energy in the wrong direction, not being able to accept bad outcomes. So again, it's a scenario where your inability to accept things makes you negative, makes you more likely to be frustrated or to complain or to not focus on solving the problems. Because there is a certain mindset or frame of how we view everything that's happening. And I did a talk recently where I was talking a lot about the mindset for winners. And one of the things I talked about a lot in that was the challenge mindset. Understanding that we need to habituate our minds through repetition to view everything like a challenge that can be solved. And so if something bad happens, we accept it immediately and we think to ourselves, how am I able to overcome this problem? Instead of thinking, oh, what could have been? That because they got lucky and I should have this. I should have won the play. He shouldn't have killed me. This is a level of entitlement that leads to a lot of tactical errors because you're getting a little bit angry or worked up. You might try to do like a revenge situation where you're trying to be greedy. You're trying to win confidence back. You're making a play that is a bad decision that's compounded. That you're compounding a bad situation essentially. And so by just practicing the acceptance of, okay, what's the data now? Situation has changed. What do I do now? I can overcome this challenge. This allows you to not be in this position where you start to really struggle with bad outcomes. And you have to practice this. And this is the thing that I think a lot of people make a mistake on. So I'm going to just make a point to really spend a second here. Is that the way that we practice needs to also be the way that we think when we're playing our official matches. Because if you don't do it, you're not suddenly going to think in a way that you haven't habituated just because you're in an official match. In an official match, you're way more dialed up. You're much less likely to be able to handle it. You're much less likely to manage it well. So we have to try to encourage and habituate all of these neural pathways that we reinforce by doing the same thing over and over again, which in this case is a challenge mindset. I can overcome any challenge. Everything is a challenge to be solved. Every problem solved is me on the way to growth and becoming the player that I want to be. Every failure is a privilege that allows me to learn, and without the failure, I'm not able to become the player I'm supposed to be. Just all these ways of thinking are very important. Okay, so I mentioned these two as well. An overly challenging or under-challenging scenario, either one can be a problem. Because overly challenging scenario, what happens with that? We are put into a position where we don't have the competencies that we need to solve the problems. So we kind of it's just a non-starter. It's just a non-starter for good performance or good learning. And if we're in an under-challenging situation, it might be the case that, again, we're just not going to be stimulated enough. We're not going to care enough. So we have to recognize when those happen, and we have to then challenge ourselves so that we'll find a way to challenge ourselves. Negativity, we kind of talked about. And the lack of focus one is I put in brackets symptom here because lack of focus tends to be a symptom of these things I described. When you're kind of down here or down here, lack of focus is going to start to happen. And it's because, if to get to the optimal arousal, you need this much energy. And what you have is, this is your tank of energy down here. And now let's say this part here is inaccessible because you're spending this part of the energy bandwidth, like complaining, for being frustrated, being emotional, all of the rest of it. Then you just don't have enough to get to where you need to go. And so what that then looks like is a lack of focus, because you can't focus on everything that you need to focus on, because that requires this. You don't have it. So this is why it's really important to sort of begin to recognize some of the realities here and to be aware of them, because one of the things I like to really remind people of is it's worth considering having a standard for high quality reps, because it's more efficient. It's more efficient. You have to spend less time playing, and you'll get way better with less time if you spend the time efficiently than if you just grind and half of the time you're not playing in a place where you're getting optimal reps. And an optimal rep is a talk in of itself. All of the things that can go into an optimal rep versus a non-optimal rep, I suppose. So I got to be careful not to go too far into like other topics. Okay, so let's see what we got next here on the journey. Okay, I'm just looking at some of the questions here real quick. How would you really overcome that subconscious tilt frustrations point? Yeah, so I mean, the overcoming tilt is going to require, typically, if you're taking the cognitive behavioral therapy approach, to understand what the trigger is and what the thinking is happening. Because usually what is going on here, we get the emotion. The emotion is a signal. And then we need to understand, okay, there was a trigger that created that signal. What is the scenario? Okay, well, then you figure out the scenario. Maybe the scenario is, actually, something I should say first is, typically these problems happen because you're holding a belief, a bias or expectation that doesn't follow reality. So it could be, for example, that you're expecting your teammate to do something specific and they don't do it, and then maybe you die as a result. Now, and it makes you angry. This is a common one, right? So even if you just get so far as to understand a trigger, understanding just where the trigger leads you, because if it does lead you to full tilt, it's such a painful experience to experience full tilt. I think most people, even just knowing what will set them off, that can sometimes be enough to be like, okay, I'm gonna back away. Like, it's not worth it, man. It's not worth it. But otherwise, if you really want to resolve it, you need to correct the thinking that exists at that trigger point. Because usually what is the case is there is faulty logic and faulty thinking that needs to be corrected. And once you go through that process of correcting it, so in this instance, for example, it's like, okay, well, is there any expectation that's reasonable that my teammate should do what I think that he should do? Well, usually, let's say if it's like in matchmaking or something, well, no, no one drops into matchmaking. Like, I wouldn't want it to be the other way around. I wouldn't want my teammate to expect me to do something specific. I have no obligation to anyone. I'm just like dropping in to play some matchmaking, and there's no contract that I signed that said I should have a certain level of skill, or I should care as much as the next person on my team, or that I should communicate, or that I should do anything, almost. There's no, we don't sign any contracts. There's no expectation of those things. So, but the trigger is caused by an expectation where you think that one of those things is true. So we have to kind of get back to what is the reasonable reality and correct the logic. And then once we get to the trigger the next time, we can then diffuse it by re-injecting that logic that we've gone over in the past. And this is just a very basic, common way that you might look to resolve a mental game leak. And that's just a very basic example. It can get a little bit more complicated and in depth, but because actually, we might be looking at one of those examples. I'll give you guys an anecdote in a moment from my competing years. But let's talk about consistently achieving the zone. This is like the part of the presentation that probably everyone wants to understand the best. So one of the things we can do, because we spent a lot of time sort of understanding what the zone is, trying to define it. What are the things that allow us to get there? What are the things that kind of take us out of there? So one of the things we want to do is we want to identify the zone experience. And so this is like, just gathering the data. I'm a big fan of this approach when it comes to performance. We want to try to operate from a point of data, because that gives us then an ability or a framework that's consistent that we can kind of tweak over time to kind of get, hotter and hotter and hotter as we make those tweaks to like getting us the best results for ourselves, because every player is different. And so we need, there's not a one size fits all in terms of where the data is, but, you can, of course, apply the frameworks to everybody. So we can all identify our own zone profile. So, what are the energy levels? Are you really intense? Are you emotionally feeling like just on fire, like just really hot? Or are you feeling like icy and cool and calm and collected? And maybe you're not super energized. Where's your decision making? What are the decisions that you make that are super sick when you're really in the zone? What are your mechanics like that are different? What was your preparation like before you got into the zone today? What is the first sign that you're slipping out of the zone? This is like, what does the exit door look like? This is almost like what we're trying to do right now is we're trying to see, okay, well, what does the entry door look like? What does the room look like when we're inside of it? And then what does the exit look like? And so there was an exercise I did actually that I'm going to share with you guys that I did with a sports psychologist many years ago that I found pretty effective for me to kind of work out some of these details. Because this is very difficult to do. This is actually very difficult to do, because what it requires is that you have awareness of when you're in the zone. But we already know that that's going to ask us to apply some cognitive bandwidth that will probably knock us out of the zone, to have the awareness when we're in the zone of what it feels like to be in the zone. So it's kind of like it's a bit tricky. This is why it's difficult. And so there's a bunch of different tricks that we can kind of use to try to help us with this. One of those things is just awareness, just really trying to is trying to apply the practice of awareness. How are we feeling? Just like getting the sense of what does it feel like when I'm not focused? What does it feel like when I'm in my C game? What does it feel like? Having this ability to be aware of where you are when you sit down to practice for that day, you can build this. This is a muscle. You can build it over time, and this is very useful if you're a competitor, because this gives you more data to use to further tweak your processes. So awareness and just general practice of awareness is good. Now, the second thing is understanding how to find the moment. So there are going to be moments when you're in the zone. I would highly recommend clipping those moments and trying to, after you're done playing, make it your mission after you're done playing. Like I spent a few weeks where I was doing this, where I was going through my matches and my practices and everything. And my one mission after I was done playing was to remember, to try like snapshot how it felt when I was going through like a play where I was in the zone. And so the idea was I was essentially mining for the data for this. And so that's what you want to do. You want to try to find a clip, like something that really encapsulates how you are when you're in the zone. And then once you can find that, if you can find like a really good clip that demonstrates you at that level where you're having that experience, then you can start to like watch it over and over again and sort of begin to then, we then move into like almost a meditation practice where what you want to try to understand it, like start like visualizing and trying to really recall the experience. And you can do this with, just closing your eyes, like playing it back through your mind and trying to just like meditate and sit there and get into sort of a different sort of like state of mind with like with relaxation, with deep breathing and so on. And then try to really understand, what imagery comes to mind, when you're in that place. And so, I actually did this exercise with a sports psychologist, as I mentioned, and I ended up coming up with this imagery. And it's kind of weird because it's like, where does this come from? I don't know, but it just happened. We're just this imagery of I was like in this icy cave, right? And this is when I realized that for me, the zone is really calm. And so when I'm doing stuff that puts me away from calm, I'm not going to be able to reach the zone because I need that emotional state of that level of relaxation. And this completely transformed my pre-performance routines, because then my pre-performance routines became about how do I get into that emotional state? And then I can use the anchors of that imagery, because I'm anchoring the imagery to the emotions, to then be a part of my prep when I'm trying to get, basically start as hot as possible before I play a match. And then this goes into the routine. So you're reinforcing it every single time, you sit down to play. And so, then we get to this zone routine that I'm describing here, where basically, you create some kind of routine around this. It fits into your routine. It's another tool in the toolkit to help you because we're not even, like I said, you can't guarantee that you're in the zone. But what we can try to do is understand, where does our optimal performance live? And if that's the emotional state that I'm in when I'm in the zone, then all I have to do is just put myself there, and maybe it will happen. If I'm doing enough of the right other things on a given day, it might happen more frequently. And I found that to be the case, which was pretty cool. And another reason it was pretty cool is because then what I started to run into was actual problems, where I started to get into the spot of I think it's the next one, getting back into the zone. It's the next slide. I got into the spot where suddenly I'm like, well, now I'm able to get into the zone more. I'm seeing a pattern. I'm exposed to a pattern where I'm dropping out of it. And I'm sure that a lot of you have experienced, you're in the zone and then you drop out and you're like, shit, I don't want to be dropping out of it. I'm crushing right now. And so I got more exposed to that. And with the extra awareness I developed, I started to be able to apply strategies to kind of prevent the particular issues I had there. So I'll just go over this second part and then we'll get into that. So in the zone routine, you can place that tool that I mentioned somewhere in there. Maybe you can start with like removing the distractions. You warm up and start in the right energy state. So you have some general senses to like, if you're a super energized person, more relaxed, don't listen to, like I was, to super intense music and stuff like that when you should be listening to calming music, if that's the case. Your mental preparation, your standards. I tend to go through a routine for myself as a player where I'll start with a little bit of technique work. I'll do a multi-phasal kind of warm-up where it goes through very specific techniques with weapons and movement. And then I roll it all in together, and then I do a thing called what I call emotional warm-up, where essentially I just start to merge all of the mechanics and all together, all the techniques. I just like run around, and my goal is to just feel good in the game. And then I go into a thing I call the mental game contract, which is that's my mental prep and the standards. So we talked about the challenge mindset. I believe that's very important to reinforce. So the mental preparation and standards, that's what I'm talking about. Re-agree with yourself every time you sit down to play. How am I going to face challenge? And one of the reasons why I mention this is because it ties into all of this stuff, like all this stuff that I was mentioning. All this stuff drains energy. How are we going to get to optimal performance if we don't have an immune system, a mental immune system, if we don't have a mental firewall toward the stuff that's going to drain us away from good performances? So that's kind of what this part is about. And that's, why deep breathing or visualization can be helpful as well, because it can help you to physiologically reset. Because sometimes we're physiologically dialed up. We're going to start our practice session. Maybe there was an argument. Maybe we've got a lot of anxiety right now. It can be kind of nice to have something that just resets you no matter what your day's looking like. And then, once you finish playing, you have your post-session cool down. So maybe you're consolidating and journaling, figuring out, okay, what are the 3 focuses I'm going to continue to carry into the next playing session? The emotional cleanup, if there's anything that really sucked, you don't want to carry that into the next day, so you can kind of deal with that very quickly. And then you have, based off of this consolidation, okay, well, what's my future warm-up and focus is going to look like? Should that stay the same? Okay, so I'm trying to move a bit more quickly because I'm spending way more time on this than I thought I would. Can you be in the zone as an IGL? It is harder. It is harder because you're having to do a lot more than focus on your own performance. You're having to micromanage a lot more. So it's a lot harder to be in the zone, but you can absolutely do it. As you say, it is just harder to come by. And it's kind of a trope in a way that the IGLs are not fraggers in a way, or IGLs can't frag type of thing, but it is legit. IGLs are having to manage more pieces in the macro and are doing so with a lot more conscious effort. And you're also going into the historical data of the game. There's a continuity between rounds that you're analyzing to make predictions as to like, how do you call the next round? What is the counterplay they may employ? So there's so much additional stuff you're doing that it's hard to have the same expectations. Okay, so getting back into the zone. Okay, so if you're in the zone and you're kind of struggling, you're falling out of it, the first thing is you want to try to identify the patterns. So what are the earliest signs that you've fallen out of the zone? For me, I would have this thing where I would start to realize I was playing really well, and I would start to actively, consciously enjoy it, almost like I'm looking on the outside in, being like, man, this is great, like, right? So that's something that would happen to me, and that would be a sign for me. And it's actually really weird because I kind of had to dive a little bit deep on this, and I ended up realizing that another reason that I was dropping out of the zone was because I had kind of like this fear that playing my best might not be good enough, and that if I'm in the zone, there is like no excuse for me not to win. Like I should win, and so I had to like figure that out. There was like a kind of a deeper thing going on there that I had to slowly discover and correct. It took me a while to figure that out. Once I'd kind of had the awareness, and once I figured that out, I was able to inject the logic. So like I rehearsed the corrected logic because I would notice what is the early sign that I'm falling out of the zone. Okay, connect the corrected logic. This is a great mental game tool that I discussed earlier, and then it just diffuses it. And this was successful for me, and it was amazing because I had played for years without being able to solve that. And the prepared statements are very similar too. Prepared statements can be mantras where it doesn't necessarily need to be for a specific issue, but it could be more generalized. And there's lots of different ways to have this, where this is basically like a disruption mechanism. So if you notice a trigger, so failure could be a trigger. There's a famous tennis player, I forget who it was, and what he did was every time in practice he would make a mistake, he would slap himself on the thigh. I think if he gave a point or something, he slapped himself on the thigh like really briefly, and he would create like basically a physical anchor to an idea. What the idea was is that failure is how I become the best in the world. It's how I become the player that I need to be. So it's a reframing exercise that he conditioned. And the reason why he did this so religiously in practice is because then when he was in competition and there was the pressure was on top of him, he could use this method. Obviously not as practical, I think, for esports players necessarily, but he could use this method, and it would allow him to accept it immediately and zoom his focus back away from failure, away from negativity, and stay in the challenge mindset. So that's kind of like what some of this is there to do. Either you're addressing a specific faulty way of thinking, or you are trying to make sure that you're staying in the correct frame. Okay, I'm going to go back to 2. I went 1, 3, and we're going 2 now. So we've got steady your mind. So this is helpful. So there's the physiological sigh. If you guys are familiar with that, this is one of the most practical ones from Huberman. I'm sure everyone knows this one already now. Ice water is good especially for anxiety. That's a great just reset switch right there. If you have the ice water like next to your PC when you're playing, that's next level. I salute you. Okay, so the physiological sigh is worth looking up if you've not heard about it from Andrew Huberman before. It's 2 in-breaths through the nose. The first one is a full inhale followed by, and your lungs should be kind of technically full, and then another sniff in, and then you breathe it out through pursed lips. So it looks like this. And you would want to breathe out a bit slower than that, but that's kind of that's a physiological sign. It's kind of an instant kind of physiological reset. That's pretty helpful and practical that you can use. Okay, and so then the next one we have, the 4th one is a task reminder. So I'm trying to go a bit faster because I've got to the top of the hour now. So I was a lot slower than I thought. It's always the way. So task reminder, remember or focus on the current objective in the game. So this is another really important one because it's you can ground yourself in your job. Marshal your thinking back to what you're trying to solve and what you're trying to do. And usually this is very helpful because usually what happens when you experience a failure or a difficult scenario, your mind is like, I want a way out. So I want to complain. I want to be frustrated and all the rest of it. I don't want to accept this because if I have to accept it, I have to deal with it. And that's going to be kind of hard and taxing. And man, this sucks. And there's so much more work because I failed. So I'm going to be, maybe I'm in a disadvantage now. So it's more work now. So just focusing yourself just very, in a very cold fashion as to like, what is the next item that I have to do? What's the next priority? is very helpful. And being able to think in this way is actually an important exercise as a player. Because another issue many players have is they go through patterns of play and behavior, and they don't have a great ability, because it's not super practiced, to understand what is my job at any given moment. What is the value that I can provide at any given moment? And if you're always able to understand what that is, then you can focus on it. And if you're able to focus on that, then you're going to be in a good spot. Okay. And man, I really packed this presentation full of stuff. So this is the last slide. Catch you later, Casey. Last slide. So these are just some insightful concepts I just wanted to like throw in at the end. So we've talked actually about quite a few of these, pretty much all of them at this point. So the A game journal. So this is note taking after playing in the zone. And so we talked about the zone and how you can learn from it. And this is really an effective way to do that. So if you're very focused on improving my C game, improving my A game, you're not going to always be in your A game. You're going to be in your A game less than your C game, most likely. And you're going to be in the zone even less. So if ever you are in the zone and you can remember to do this, it's actually very helpful if you can do that, because we're gathering the data. The inchworm concept is the idea that, your performance is a range, and, you're going to be anywhere in this range at any given time, but your job is to improve the C game so that the C game becomes much tighter. You get rid of all of this, and then you're much closer now to your A game. And the way that you move forwards is by improving your C game and improving your A game. That's how you move forwards as a player. So these are two areas we kind of try to focus on. The C game's the easiest one to focus on most consistently. There's always problems to solve, fundamentals to improve. Pit stops. So strategic breaks or mental recovery. So non-sleep deep rest is another thing from Huberman I think is really, really good. It's like it can be a 10 to 20 minute meditation exercise that's guided. And it's something that allows you, it's very refreshing. It's almost like the same effect as if you took a nap and actually had some sleep. So if you're in a day that's very difficult, challenging, mentally exhausting, this is going to refresh you. And so if you want to have a break in let's say you're in between two-hour blocks or something, this is really nice to hit that second block in a more refreshed way, so you get high quality practice. And it's also a very good way to reset physiologically. So if you're stressed, you're triggered, tilted, any of the rest of it, then you can kind of reset yourself with this. Hyper-awareness is one I kind of talked about, where fixating on the fact that you're in the zone can distract you and cause you to fall out of it, which is, I already mentioned that happened to me. It's a fun one. That's a tricky one to solve, because usually the fixation happens for a specific reason. And so like I said, for me, it was a fear of losing, which is kind of hard. Like where do you get that? It took me a while to figure that out. So the fixation happens for a reason. So we're going to have to figure out, why am I fixating on this? That's what we kind of need to figure out if this happens. And then lastly, the problem of a wide range. If the gap between the A and C game is too wide, your brain is burning energy too inefficiently to stay in the zone for long, because you're going to come into contact with one of your weaknesses. Because again, if your range is like really, really wide, then odds are you're going to be exposed to the bad parts of your range at some point. Like, it's quite likely. If your range is really tight in the upper ends, it's going to be much less likely you'll get exposed to the bad part of your range. What to do during a pit stop? Really anything that for you feels like a mental recovery. And it's kind of something that can be different for people, and it depends. It depends on what resets you, because for some people it depends on the situation, where if you're really worked up and you can do an activity that helps you to reset completely, it doesn't matter what that activity is. We're all different. And so I would never want to prescribe to be too overly prescriptive. There are things that I can say that scientifically, physiologically will reset you. So I can be comfortable universally recommending it, such as NSDR. But other than that, whatever works. To reduce your range, you need to be looking at what your weaknesses are. So the first step is always identifying. I'm just trying to find a clearer slide here. The first step is just identifying your range. So when you're in your C game, what are the types of mistakes that you see when you're in a C game? So because it's all connected. It's all connected. Usually in your C game, you're not just making worse decisions and making tactical mistakes. you're also maybe you might have an energy issue. You might be underslept. You might be a bit more frustrated than normal. You might be a little bit more mentally taxed than normal. You might be missing more shots than normal. Any of these things can trigger other problems. And and so what you want to try to understand is where are the patterns? What does my C game look like? And then once you identify it, let's say a tactical issue you spot is overpeaking. I notice that when I'm playing poorly, I overpeak a lot. Okay, so now we have a problem to try to solve. So next time we're in our C game, we can figure out, okay, now is an opportunity. Not to be frustrated because I know I'm in my sucky part of my range right now, but it's an opportunity to practice and to employ things that I've worked on in my practice or problems. I've tried to solve this problem, let's say beforehand, by thinking, what do I do to solve overpeaking? I know that I'm in my C game. I know I'm going to make this mistake. What should I do now when I next do it? Like, should I just make a rule? Maybe that's the solution to begin with. And that could be a great solution because you want to stop the habit. So, okay, the rule could be, I'm only going to repeak once and no more. Like, that's the hard rule. Or not at all. Not at all. Because oftentimes what happens is when we get into these patterns, it triggers other problems. So you'll then have a problem with confidence because now you feel like you are dying more, you're in worse spots, your money's going to be a bit fucked up. You might be in a spot where not just your confidence is shot, but now you're trying to win your confidence back. So now you're making greed mistakes. You're trying to, or revenge mistakes, or entitlement mistakes, where you're making tactical plays to recover those issues. So we want to kind of look at it from all of these different angles and start to work on it. And the other thing about the C game as well is that the C game and your entire performance is always held up by your fundamentals too. So if you're working on all of the good Counter-Strike fundamentals and just always improving those in addition to the specific issues you spot in your C game, then you're going to be able to move that part of your range forwards. But the idea is that you see patterns and you start like working to solve them. And again, it all starts from awareness. You have to be aware that the things that I'm doing aren't isolated. I'm probably going to be repeating these mistakes. And so I have to take this as an opportunity to solve those. The mistake a lot of players do is they think that they are entitled to performing in a certain way and that their performance is the same every day, that they're like the same player every day. But you're not the same player every day. You could start the day in any one of these different points, day to day. And so really it's a journey of learning what every part of your range as a player looks like. How does it look like when you're playing really, really well? What's your B game look like? How's that differentiated from your C game? Because I can absolutely differentiate my C game, my B game, and my A game. It feels very different to me. And that's why we split it up between 3 areas, because it's a little bit easier to identify these 3 different areas. And if we split it up more, then they'll be a lot more difficult. So there are some ideas that might be helpful for you, because I'm not looking at your VODs, so I don't know what the types of issues you're making are, but look at everything: tactical, mechanical, so tactical being like your decision making. Are you making bad decisions? Emotional is anything to do with the tactical decision making tied into emotions. So sometimes when you know that you're playing bad, you're kind of feeling down bad. You're not feeling like, now you're going to maybe be more hesitant as a player, right? So we need to kind of we need to stop things getting away from us emotionally by kind of bringing back to what should we be doing? What are the correct plays to make? As opposed to playing on feeling to the degree that we are kind of being led around by the nose by whatever kind of state that we're in, and leaving it to chance. And with that, I think can hitting my wave realistically reset me, because I catch myself hitting it more often after I die or rounds over. I don't know. I don't know with the vaping. One, I mean, it's you can kind of anchor in any framing tool into pretty much any behavior if you just reinforce it enough with repetition. But it takes some work to do that, because you have to create whatever the framing is, and then assign that again and again and again and again. And it's kind of like what we talked about earlier, where you're going through this process again, where you're having to spend a lot of time consciously reinforcing this thing. And it takes a while. It can take a while until it becomes something that's really automatic, where just doing that thing is then like just fully anchored, and you just like inherently know what what it is, what that trigger means. So but you can do everything, pretty much anything. With that said, I'm gonna have to jet off. We started